Gustav Nordquist told Martha Krause she would watch her children freeze to death in January. 8 cords of wood minimum, he said. She had no wagon, no horses, no money, and the timber was 12 miles away. The math was simple. A widow alone with 3 children and $23 could not survive a Dakota winter. Nordquist had buried a wife on these plains. He knew what he was talking about. But in February 1881, when the worst blizzard in memory killed Carl Lindstrom 80 yards from his barn, Martha's children slept barefoot on warm stone. Her fire had been out for hours. Her neighbors were burning furniture. She had built something Nordquist had never seen. This is how. The children slept barefoot on stone. Outside, the wind screamed at 60 miles an hour, driving snow so thick a person could not see 3 steps from the door. The temperature had not risen above 15 below zero in 2 weeks. This was the 9th day of a blizzard that showed no sign of ending, and somewhere in that howling white darkness, Carl Lindstrom's body lay frozen in a drift 80 yards from his barn. He had gone to check on the animals yesterday morning. He never came back. But inside Martha Krause's sod house, her 3 children lay sleeping on the floor, not huddled by the stove, not wrapped in every blanket they owned, sleeping in their nightclothes, their bare feet resting on flat stones that radiated warmth from a fire she had let die 6 hours ago. The cook stove sat cold and dark. No smoke rose from its pipe. Yet the floor beneath her children held the heat of yesterday's cooking fire, releasing it slowly through the night while the world outside tried to kill everything that breathed. A quarter-mile east, Anna Lindstrom was burning her dining table to keep her children alive. Her husband's body would not be recovered for 3 more days. A mile west, the Hoffman cabin had been silent since Tuesday. No smoke from the chimney, no movement at the windows. Martha stood in the darkness and watched her children breathe. Anna, 6 years old, Wilhelm, 4, Emma, 14 months. They were alive because 5 months earlier, in September of 1880, Martha had done something no one in Dakota Territory had ever seen. She had dug a trench across her earthen floor. 5 months before the blizzard, Martha Krause stood in the doorway of her half-built soddy and tried to calculate how long it would take her children to die. The arithmetic was simple. A family needed 4 to 7 cords of firewood to survive a Dakota winter. Trees grew only along the rivers, and the nearest river timber was 12 miles away. Hauling required a wagon and a team of horses. Martha had neither. Her husband Heinrich had died of typhoid in July, leaving her with a 16 by 20-foot sod house, 2 milk cows, 12 chickens, $23 in cash, and 3 children who did not understand that their father was never coming home. She could not cut the wood herself. She could not afford to buy it, and she could not take her children back east because train fare to Minnesota cost more than she had, and abandoning the claim meant losing everything Heinrich had worked to build. The neighbors said she should remarry, find a man who needed a wife and children, trade her body and her labor for survival. It was what women did. Martha had been married once. She had loved Heinrich Krause for 11 years, had followed him from Pennsylvania to the edge of the world, had buried him in soil so new it didn't have a name yet. She was not ready to belong to another man. She might never be ready. But readiness did not matter. Winter was coming, and winter did not negotiate. The old man arrived on a Tuesday in late September. Gustav Nordquist was 58 years old, a Swedish immigrant who had survived 11 Dakota winters. He had buried a wife in the blizzard of 73 and 2 neighbors in the hard freeze of 75. When Nordquist spoke about winter, people listened because Nordquist was still alive. He rode up to Martha's soddy on a gray mare that looked as weathered as he did. He did not dismount. He sat in his saddle and studied her woodpile, less than half a cord of scraps and twisted hay, and her cook stove pipe poking through the sod roof, and her children playing in the dirt with a wooden spoon and a tin cup. Martha watched him calculate. She knew what he was adding up. Nordquist finally spoke. His voice sounded like gravel dragged over ice. 8 cords, he said. That's what you need, minimum, for a house this size with a stove that small. Martha said nothing. A man alone could maybe cut that much between now and first snow, Nordquist continued. Maybe, if he worked every day, didn't stop to eat, didn't waste time on foolishness. He looked at her children. The baby had started to cry. You're not a man alone. I know what I am. Do you? Nordquist leaned forward in his saddle. Let me tell you what I see. I see a woman who can't cut 8 cords of timber, can't haul it 12 miles without a wagon, can't afford to buy it at $4 a cord, can't keep 3 children alive and 10 animals and build up fuel stocks all at once. He paused. I see a woman who's going to watch her children freeze to death in January, and there's not a thing she can do about it except what she's too proud to do. Which is what? Find a husband. Go back east. One or the other. Nordquist gathered his reins. I buried my wife after 13 years on this prairie. 13 years, Mrs. Krause. She knew what she was doing. She knew winter, and it killed her anyway. He turned the mare. You've been here 2 years. You don't know anything yet, and you're going to find that out the hard way, one way or another. He rode off without looking back. Martha stood in her doorway and felt the wind beginning to shift, the first cold edge of autumn sliding down from the north. Everything he said was true. She could not cut the wood. She could not buy it. She could not keep fires burning through the night with twisted hay. It burned too fast, required stoking every 20 minutes, meant no sleep for months. She could not do what every other settler did because she did not have what every other settler had. That night, putting Anna to bed on the packed dirt floor, Martha felt the cold rising up through the earth. The girl curled into a ball, shivering, her breath making small clouds in the lantern light. The floor was cold in September. By December, it would be frozen solid. Martha remembered something then, something Heinrich had told her years ago about the war. He had served as a hospital steward at City Point, Virginia, in the winter of 1864. The wounded came in faster than the surgeons could treat them, and the medical tents had no stoves, no proper heating, nothing but canvas walls between the dying men and the freezing wind. But the surgeon in charge had been clever. He ordered trenches dug through the tent floors, covered with flat stones and sealed with river clay. The cooking fires outside fed smoke through those trenches, and the stones absorbed the heat, and the wounded lay on warm ground while snow fell outside. Heinrich had described it one evening in that rambling way he had, talking about the war while Martha sewed and pretended not to listen. She had thought it sounded foolish. Heating the floor? Heat rises. Everyone knew heat rises. Warming the ground was doing things backwards. She had told Heinrich as much. He had laughed and said maybe so, but those wounded men had slept warm when the rest of the camp was shivering. Now Martha looked at her daughter on the cold dirt floor, and she thought about flat stones and trenches and smoke that traveled under the ground instead of up into the air. Heinrich was dead, but his stories were still alive, and Martha was beginning to wonder if desperation might make her smart enough to use them. For 3 days, Martha did nothing but think. She walked the perimeter of her sod house, studying the walls. 30 inches thick, built from bricks of prairie grass and soil, each one weighing 50 pounds. The walls held heat. She had noticed this before. In the evening, after a hot day, the inside of the soddy stayed warm long after sunset. The thick earth absorbed the warmth and released it slowly. The floor was the same material, packed dirt, tamped down hard before the walls went up. If the walls could hold heat, the floor could hold heat. The question was how to get the heat into the floor in the first place. On the fourth day, Martha took a stick and drew a line in the dirt. The line ran from the corner where her cook stove sat diagonally across the floor to the far wall. 14 feet, give or take. If she dug a trench along that line, a shallow trench, maybe 8 or 10 inches deep, and covered it with flat stones and sealed the joints with clay, the smoke would have to flow through the trench. That meant the fire had to be lower than the trench entrance, so the hot gas would move horizontally instead of straight up. And there had to be a chimney at the far end, tall enough to pull the smoke through the whole length. Martha stood in the center of her soddy and tried to see it. A lowered fire pit in the corner, a trench across the floor, flat stones on top, clay sealing every joint, a chimney pipe rising from the far wall. The cooking fire would heat the stones. The stones would hold the heat. Her children would sleep on warm ground instead of frozen dirt. It might work. It might also fill her house with smoke and kill them all in their sleep. Martha spent 2 more days working through the problems. The fire pit had to be 18 inches below floor level, low enough to create pressure that pushed smoke into the trench, high enough that she could still cook without climbing into a hole. The stones had to be thick enough to bear weight, 3 or 4 inches at minimum. The clay ceiling had to be perfect because any crack would leak smoke into the room and the chimney. The chimney had to be tall, at least 8 feet above the roof line, probably more. The taller the chimney, the stronger the draft, the faster the smoke would pull through. She found flat stones at the creek bed 12 miles away. Limestone, gray-brown, the kind that split into natural slabs. Some were 4 inches thick, some were 6. She could carry 3 or 4 at a time, 60 pounds or more, if she wrapped them in her apron and balanced the load against her hip. 12 miles there. 12 miles back. 6 hours for each trip, moving slowly, stopping to rest. She would need 40 or 50 stones. Martha looked at the calendar scratched into her wall. September 23rd. If the winter came early, and everyone said this winter would come early, she had maybe 4 weeks, maybe less. 4 weeks to dig a trench, gather 50 stones, lower a fire pit, build a chimney, seal every joint, and pray that a dead man's war story was enough to keep her children alive. She picked up the spade and started digging. Anna Lindstrom found her 3 days later, standing in a knee-deep trench with dirt in her hair and blood on her palms. Anna was Martha's nearest neighbor, a quarter-mile east. 34 years old, mother of 4, with a husband who worked hard and a house that was properly stocked for winter. She brought a jar of pickled beets and an expression that suggested she thought Martha might have lost her mind. "What are you doing?" Anna asked. Martha climbed out of the trench. Her back screamed. Her hands were blistered under the blood, and the blisters had broken, and new blisters were forming over the open wounds. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night since she'd started digging. "Heating channel," Martha said. "The smoke from the cooking fire will run through it, under the floor. The stones on top will hold the warmth." Anna stared at the trench. She stared at the pile of flat stones stacked against the wall. She stared at Martha. "Heat rises," Anna said. "I know." "Everyone knows heat rises. That's why you put the stove in the middle of the room, so the heat goes up and spreads out." Anna shook her head. "You're heating the floor? The floor is dirt. Dirt doesn't get warm. Dirt just sits there being cold." "Stone gets warm. The stones will sit on top of the trench. The smoke passes under them, heats them up. They hold the heat and let it out slowly." "You've seen this work?" Martha hesitated. "My husband described it, from the war. The army hospitals use something like it." "Described it." Anna's voice went flat. "Your husband described it. And you're digging up your floor because of something your husband described. Yes. Anna set down the jar of pickled beets. She walked to the edge of the trench and looked in. 8 inches deep, 10 inches wide, running half the length of the room. The walls of the trench were rough but solid, packed earth that would hold its shape. If this fills with smoke, Anna said quietly, where does the smoke go? Up the chimney at the far end. And if the chimney doesn't draw properly, if the smoke backs up, I'll seal it, every joint, every crack, clay over everything. And if the clay cracks, if the stones shift, if the smoke starts leaking up through the floor while your children are sleeping. Anna turned to look at her. You're putting fire under your children's beds, Martha. You understand that, yes? You're putting fire and smoke under the place where your babies sleep. Martha understood. She had thought about it every night since she started. She had dreamed about smoke filling the room, about waking to find her children still and silent, about explaining to God why she had gambled their lives on a dead man's story. But she had also dreamed about January, about the cold that crept up through the floor and turned little fingers blue, about running out of fuel in February and burning the furniture, the door, the wooden spoons, everything that would catch flame, about her children's bodies frozen stiff in their beds because she had been too afraid to try something new. I've seen what happens when settlers don't have enough fuel, Martha said. My husband told me about that too. The ones who burned their floors for warmth and fell through into the frozen ground below. The ones who burned their doors and couldn't keep the wind out. The ones who kept their children wrapped in blankets until the blankets froze to their skin. She looked at Anna. I can die the regular way, doing what everyone does, not having enough of what everyone needs. Or I can try something else and maybe die differently, but at least I'll have tried. Anna was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up the jar of beets and set it on the table by the door. I'll pray for you, she said. The way she said it made clear she didn't expect the prayers to help. The preacher came the second week of October, and he didn't come alone. Reverend Elias Whitmore was a Methodist circuit rider, 45 years old, with a voice that could fill a barn and eyes that seemed to see sin in everything. He served 6 settlements across Kingsbury County, traveling from claim to claim, marrying the willing and burying the dead, and generally making himself the authority on matters of God and propriety. He arrived at Martha's soddy on a buckboard driven by Silas Brennan. Martha knew Brennan by reputation. 52 years old, a widower with a successful farm 3 miles south, looking for a new wife to replace the one who had died in childbirth the year before. He had 3 children of his own who needed minding, and a claim that needed a woman's work, and no interest in romance or courtship or any of the things that made marriage bearable. What Brennan wanted was a transaction, a body in exchange for survival. Martha had seen him watching her at the church meeting last month, calculating her usefulness the way he might calculate the value of a plow horse. The 2 men found her covered in clay dust, her dress torn at the hem, her hair wild, standing over a trench that now ran the full length of her floor. 41 stones were stacked and mortared in place. The fire pit yawned 18 inches deep in the corner. And her children played near the half-finished chimney, unsupervised, while their mother worked. Whitmore climbed down from the buckboard and surveyed the scene. His expression suggested he had found exactly what he expected to find: chaos, madness, and a woman who had forgotten her place. Mrs. Krause, he said, I've heard troubling reports. Have you? I've heard you're digging holes in your floor. I've heard you're neglecting your children. I've heard you're... He paused, searching for the word, experimenting. With fire. Under your home. I'm building a heating system. Whitmore smiled. It was not a kind smile. A heating system, I see. And do you have any training in construction, Mrs. Krause? Any experience in engineering? Any knowledge whatsoever about how heat and fire in buildings work? My husband was an Army hospital steward. He saw systems like this during the war. Your husband, God rest him, is dead. What he saw or didn't see is no longer relevant. Whitmore gestured to the trench, the stones, the mess. What is relevant is that you have 3 children in your care, and you are putting them at risk with this foolishness. Brennan spoke for the first time. His voice was softer than Whitmore's, but no less certain. Mrs. Krause, I know you're grieving. I know the loss of a husband is hard, but winter's coming, and you're not ready. Anyone can see you're not ready. I'll be ready. Will you? Brennan took a step toward her. I've got a warm house, 3 miles from here. Room enough for your children and mine. I'm not asking for love, Mrs. Krause. I'm not asking for anything except what's practical. You need shelter. I need help. We could solve each other's problems. Martha looked at him, at his clean clothes and his well-fed face, and his eyes that saw her as a solution rather than a person. My husband died so I could have this land, she said. I'm not going to give it to a stranger. Whitmore shook his head. Pride, Mrs. Krause. Pride goeth before a fall. The Lord provides for those who accept his provision, and Brother Brennan is here as an instrument of that provision. Your stubbornness endangers not just your body, but your children's souls. Their souls are fine. Are they? Whitmore pointed at the trench. That pit you're digging looks like a grave. I pray it doesn't become one. He turned back to the buckboard. When you're burning your furniture to stay alive, Mrs. Krause, remember that I offered you salvation. Remember that Brother Brennan opened his door. And remember that you chose pride over your children's lives. They rode away without looking back. Martha stood in the wreckage of her floor and felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear. Something harder than fear. Determination. The first blizzard hit on October 15th. Martha had 41 stones in place. She needed at least 9 more. The fire pit was lowered but not fully sealed. The chimney stood 4 feet tall. She needed another 4 feet at minimum. The storm came in from the northwest like a living thing, howling and clawing, driving snow sideways through every crack in the walls. The temperature dropped to 5 below zero before midnight. Anna, her 6-year-old, developed a cough that rattled in her chest like stones in a jar. For 3 days, Martha huddled with her children around the cook stove in its original position, feeding it hay and chips, watching the fuel pile shrink, feeling the cold rise through the unfinished floor. The stones that were already in place stayed warmer than the bare dirt. She could feel the difference when she walked across them, but the system wasn't connected. The smoke went up the stovepipe, not through the trench. The heat escaped into the air instead of storing in the stone. On the 4th day, the storm broke. The sky turned blue and hard and mercilessly bright. The temperature climbed to 15 above zero, which felt like summer after what they'd endured. Martha walked outside and looked at the world. Snow drifts 4 feet deep, her animals alive but frightened, and the sky to the northwest already showing that gray-green color that meant more was coming. She had 3 weeks, maybe less, and she was not even close to ready. The next 20 days blurred into a single continuous effort. Martha woke before dawn and worked until she could no longer see. She dug and hauled and lifted and sealed. She walked the 12-mile round trip to the creek bed 8 more times, carrying stones that grew heavier with each journey, her shoulders rubbed raw under her dress, her ankles swelling until her boots wouldn't fit, blisters forming on top of blisters until her hands looked like something from a war hospital. The children helped where they could. Anna, 6 years old, watched the babies and fetched water and held stones in place while Martha packed clay around them. Wilhelm, 4 years old, carried small rocks and pushed clay into cracks with his tiny fingers. Emma, 14 months, cried and cried and cried because her mother was never still, never available, never the warm and patient presence she had been before Papa died. Martha ate standing up. She slept in her clothes. She lost weight she could not afford to lose, her dress hanging loose, her cheekbones sharpening, her body burning itself for fuel. On October 27th, she dropped a stone. It was a big one, 50 pounds or more, a perfect slab of gray limestone that would have covered the last open section of trench. She was lowering it into place, her arms trembling with exhaustion, and it slipped. The edge caught another stone already mortared in position. A crack appeared, running the length of the installed slab. Martha stared at the cracked stone. The crack was too wide to seal. The smoke would leak through. She would have to pull up the damaged stone and replace it. She didn't have a replacement. She had used every stone she'd gathered. The creek bed was 12 miles away. The round trip would take an entire day. She sat down in the dirt and put her head in her hands and let herself cry for the first time since Heinrich's funeral. Anna found her there. The 6-year-old didn't say anything. She just sat down next to her mother and put a hand on her arm and waited. After a while, Martha wiped her face and stood up. There was no time for crying. There was never time for crying. There was only time for work. She would go to the creek bed tomorrow. She would carry back more stones. She would fix what was broken, because the alternative was dying, and she wasn't ready to die, and neither were her children. The help came from an unexpected direction. The next morning, Eric Lindstrom appeared at her door. Anna's oldest son, 16 years old, tall and quiet, with his mother's practical eyes and his father's strong back. He had a handcart behind him, and in the handcart were 3 flat limestone slabs. Ma sent these, he said. She had extras from a project she never finished. Martha looked at the stones. She looked at Eric. She knew what this was. Charity. The thing she had sworn she would never need, never accept, never become dependent on. But her children were inside, coughing from the cold, and the trench was one cracked stone away from useless, and she was out of time. What does she want for them? Martha asked. Nothing. She said to just take them. I'll pay. She said you'd say that. Eric almost smiled. She said if you insisted, you could send over 2 chickens. Said she needed layers and yours were good ones. 2 chickens for 3 stones. It wasn't a fair trade. Martha was getting the better end by far. But it was a trade, not charity. It let her keep her pride while accepting the help she needed. Tell your mother thank you, Martha said, and tell her the chickens will be over tomorrow. Eric nodded. He unloaded the stones, stacking them carefully by the door. Then he paused. Is it true what they're saying? He asked. About the floor? That you're trying to heat it from underneath? It's true. Does it work? Martha looked at the trench, the stones, the chimney rising against the wall. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in January. Eric nodded again, as if this were a reasonable answer, and left with his handcart. Martha carried the stones inside. She pulled up the cracked slab, positioned a new one, mortared it into place. By evening, the floor was complete, 50 stones covering 14 feet of trench, every joint sealed with clay, the surface level, and solid enough to walk on. The next day, she finished the chimney, 8 feet above the roof line, stone and clay mortared together, a dark pipe against the October sky. On November 1st, she lit the first test fire. She built the fire in the lowered pit, using dry hay and chips, watching the flame catch and grow. The smoke rose as smoke always did, and then it didn't. The smoke hit the raised lip of the pit, pooled for a moment, and began to flow horizontally into the trench entrance. Martha held her breath. The smoke traveled. She could track its progress by the sound, a faint whispering hiss as hot gas moved through the channel. 5 feet, 10 feet. Then, at the far end of the room, smoke emerged from the chimney pipe and rose into the cold air outside. She waited. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. No smoke leaked into the room. The seals held. The chimney drew properly. The system worked. She knelt on the floor and pressed her palm against the nearest stone. Cool, but not cold. She checked again after 30 minutes. Warm. After an hour, the stone was almost hot to the touch, 90 degrees, maybe more. Heat radiating up through the surface. Martha let the fire burn for 2 hours, then let it die. She waited. Checked the stones, still warm. Waited longer. Checked again. After 4 hours, the stones had cooled, but they were still warmer than the packed dirt around them, still radiating the heat they had absorbed. By evening, her children were sitting on the floor without shivering. Anna pressed her cheek against the warm stone and laughed, a sound Martha hadn't heard in weeks. Wilhelm lay on his belly and fell asleep in minutes, his body finally fully warm for the first time since September. Emma, the baby, stopped crying. Martha stood in the center of the room and watched her children rest. The system worked. The impossible thing that everyone said couldn't work, the thing that Gustav Nordquist had dismissed, the thing that Anna Lindstrom had warned would kill them all, it worked. But November 1st was not January. 5 below zero was not 30 below. A single test fire was not a winter's worth of survival. The skeptics were waiting. The real cold was coming, and Martha knew that everything she had built would mean nothing if it couldn't survive what was still ahead. Outside, the wind began to rise. The sky in the northwest turned the color of iron. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the approaching storm. Winter had arrived, and it was only the beginning. November passed in a blur of storms and silences. The blizzards came every few days now, rolling in from the northwest like waves against a shore, each one a little colder than the last, each one lasting a little longer. Between storms, the sky turned hard and blue, and the wind died, and the cold settled in like something permanent. Martha watched her floor and learned its rhythms. The stones needed 2 hours of fire to reach full heat. Once hot, they held that warmth for 8 to 10 hours, releasing it slowly through the night. She could cook dinner, let the fire burn for an hour afterward, then bank the coals and go to sleep knowing her children would wake to a warm floor instead of frozen dirt. The numbers told the story better than words could. On November 20th, with the temperature at 12 below zero, Martha measured the air in her soddy at 52 degrees, cool but survivable. The floor stones registered 71 degrees, warm enough that her children slept in their nightclothes with bare feet touching the surface. That same night, she knew, the Lindstrom cabin a quarter-mile east had ice forming on the interior walls. Her fuel consumption was a fraction of what Nordquist had predicted. The cooking fire did double duty, heating both the food and the floor. She burned perhaps a third of what a conventional stove would require, maybe less. Her stockpile of hay and chips, which she had feared would be exhausted by Christmas, now looked like it might last until March. Anna Lindstrom visited once in mid-November. She stood in the doorway and watched Martha's children playing on the floor, barefoot, laughing. She didn't say anything about the heating system. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. Word spread through the settlement. The Krause widow had done something strange with her floor, and somehow it was working. Some people laughed, heated floors. What foolishness. Others were curious but cautious. It was too late in the season to try anything new, and besides, the real cold hadn't come yet. Wait until January, they said. Wait until the deep freeze. Then we'll see if that contraption holds up. Nordquist didn't visit. Martha saw him once riding past on his gray mare, and he looked at her chimney with its thin trail of smoke, and he didn't stop. His face gave nothing away, but he slowed his horse just for a moment, and Martha thought she saw something in his eyes that might have been doubt. Not doubt in her system, doubt in his own certainty. December brought deeper cold. The temperature at De Smet dropped to 20 below zero on the 15th. Rail service became sporadic, then stopped entirely on the 28th. The trains wouldn't run again until May. Martha made one last trip to town on November 20th, loading up on flour, salt, and dried beans. She spent 11 of her remaining $18. After that, the roads disappeared under snow, and the world shrank to the size of her quarter-section claim. She was alone now, truly alone. The nearest neighbor might as well be 100 miles away when the wind was blowing and the snow was falling, and a person could freeze to death in the time it took to walk from the house to the barn. But her floor was warm, her children were healthy, and every morning she woke to the smell of cold air and the feel of warm stone beneath her feet, and she knew that whatever came next, she had given them a chance. The old Dakota man passed through in early December. Martha didn't know his name. Some called him Mahpia Luta, which meant red cloud, though he wasn't the famous chief by that name. He was just an old man who wandered between the white settlements, trading small goods, watching the newcomers struggle against a land his people had lived on for generations. He stopped at Martha's door and looked at her chimney. He looked at her woodpile, which was far smaller than any of her neighbors. He looked at her children, who were healthy and bright-eyed and not shivering. He said one word in English. Hard. Martha didn't know if he meant her work or the coming winter. Before she could ask, he was gone, walking west into the gray afternoon. That night, the temperature dropped to 25 below, and it kept dropping. January came, and the world turned to iron. The cold that month was unlike anything Martha had experienced. It was not just temperature, it was weight, pressure, a physical force that pressed against the walls and crept through every crack and seemed to want, with a malevolent patience, to kill everything it touched. The thermometer Heinrich had given her as a wedding present, a small glass tube with mercury that rose and fell with the weather, stopped working in the second week of January. The mercury retreated to the bottom of the tube and refused to rise. Martha later learned the temperature had dropped below -30, which was the lowest the thermometer could measure. Her floor system struggled but held. The stones cooled faster now, the heat bleeding away into air that felt solid with cold. Instead of 8 hours of warmth, she got 5 or 6. She started waking before dawn to rebuild the fire, feeding it in the darkness, watching the glow spread through the trench entrance, and knowing that somewhere beneath her feet, smoke was traveling through stone channels, warming the floor that kept her children alive. The crisis came in February. It started on the second day of the month, a Monday. Martha woke to a sound she had learned to dread, the low moan of wind building in the northwest, the whisper that became a howl, the first sign of a blizzard gathering strength. By noon, the snow was falling sideways. By evening, she could not see her own barn from the window. By midnight, the temperature had plunged to 30 below zero, and the wind was screaming at 60 miles an hour, and the world outside had become a white void that killed everything it touched. The storm did not stop. For 9 days, the blizzard raged without pause. 9 days of wind that never dropped below 40 miles an hour. 9 days of temperatures that never rose above 15 below. 9 days of snow so thick that Martha lost track of which direction was north, which was south, which led to safety, and which led to death. On the third day, Emma developed a fever. Martha noticed it during the morning feeding. The baby was hot to the touch, her skin flushed, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She wouldn't nurse. She wouldn't eat. She cried in a thin, reedy wail that sounded nothing like her normal voice. And then she stopped crying altogether and fell into a sleep that terrified Martha more than the crying had. For 3 days, Martha held her daughter and prayed. She had no medicine, no doctor within 50 miles, no way to reach help, even if help existed. All she had was warmth and time and the desperate hope that a 14-month-old body could fight off whatever sickness had taken hold. The floor system saved them. In a conventional house, Martha would have faced an impossible choice. A sick baby needed constant attention, holding, comforting, monitoring for changes. A conventional stove needed constant feeding, stoking every hour or two, especially in cold this severe. She could not do both. She would have had to choose between caring for her daughter and keeping the house warm enough for all of them to survive. But the floor did not need constant attention. Martha built the fire once in the evening, let it burn for 2 hours while she cooked thin soup, and tried to get Emma to take a few spoonfuls, then let it die. The stones held the heat. The children slept on warm ground, and Martha could spend the entire night holding her baby, watching her breathe, waiting for the fever to break. On the morning of the 5th day, Emma's fever broke. Martha woke to find her daughter looking up at her with clear eyes, reaching for her face, making the small, hungry sounds that meant she wanted to nurse. The crisis had passed, the baby would live, but outside the storm still raged, and somewhere in that howling darkness, Carl Lindstrom was dying. Martha heard about it the next day, when the impossible happened. A shape appeared at her door, a human shape, barely recognizable, covered in snow and ice, moving with the desperate slowness of someone who had used up everything they had just to arrive. It was Eric Lindstrom, the 16-year-old who had brought her stones in October. His face was white with frost. His fingers were clawed into hooks, the joints frozen, half closed. He had crawled the last 100 yards after his legs gave out, dragging himself through drifts that were taller than he was. Martha pulled him inside and stripped off his frozen clothes and laid him on the warm stones, wrapping him in blankets, rubbing his hands and feet to restore circulation, pouring warm water down his throat a spoonful at a time. He told her what had happened. His father had gone out on the 6th day of the storm. The animals needed checking, the cow was due to calf, and the chickens would freeze if someone didn't refill their water. Carl Lindstrom had tied a rope around his waist, secured the other end to the door frame, and walked toward the barn 80 yards away. He never made it. Somewhere in that 80 yards, the rope had come loose or broken or been torn from his frozen hands. The family didn't know. They only knew that the rope went slack, and when the wind died for a moment, just a moment, they looked out and saw nothing. No shape, no movement, just white. Carl Lindstrom had frozen to death within sight of his own barn, within sight of his own house. They found his body 3 days later after the storm broke, lying face down in a drift 20 feet from the barn door. He had almost made it. Almost was not enough. Now Anna Lindstrom was alone with 4 children, a house that was running out of fuel, and a husband's body that she couldn't bury until spring. Eric had come to ask for help, not for himself, for his mother and siblings. The Lindstrom cabin had burned through its entire wood supply. They had started on the furniture yesterday. When the furniture was gone, they would have nothing. Martha didn't hesitate. "Bring them here," she said. 9 people in a soddy built for 4. Martha's house was 16 by 20 feet, 320 square feet. Into that space came Anna Lindstrom and her 4 children, Eric, 16, Peter, 12, Greta, 8, and baby Johann, 2. Added to Martha's 3, that made 7 children and 2 women with barely room to stand. But the floor was warm, and warm floor was everything. They organized the space like a military operation. Children slept on the stones in shifts, the youngest first, then the older ones, rotating through the night so everyone got time on the warmest surface. The adults stayed near the walls where the air was colder, wrapping themselves in every blanket and coat they could find. Martha cooked constantly, great pots of thin soup and porridge, because cooking meant fire, and fire meant heat, and heat flowed into the stones and kept them all alive. The system became more efficient with more people. This surprised Martha. She had worried that 9 bodies would overwhelm her modest fuel supply, that the demand for warmth would exceed what the floor could provide. The opposite happened. 9 people needed more food than 3, which meant more cooking, which meant the fire burned longer each day. The stones absorbed more heat. The floor stayed warmer. The extra bodies added their own warmth to the room, raising the temperature by several degrees. On the 8th day of the blizzard, Anna Lindstrom stood on Martha's floor for the first time without moving. She had been pacing, as she'd done since arriving, pacing and watching the children and trying not to look toward the window where her husband's barn was invisible in the storm. But now she stopped. She looked down at her feet. The stones were warm. Not hot, not burning, but warm. 70 degrees, maybe more, heat rising through her boots and into her bones for the first time in weeks. Anna looked at Martha. Her eyes were red from crying, exhausted from grief, hollow from the knowledge that her husband was lying frozen in a snowdrift and she couldn't even bury him. But beneath all that, something else was surfacing. Something that looked like wonder. "You built this," Anna said. "Yes." "From what your husband told you, from a story about the war." "Yes." Anna nodded slowly. She didn't apologize for her earlier doubts. She didn't need to. They both remembered, and they both understood that being wrong about the floor didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the floor was warm, and the children were alive. And tomorrow they would all wake up and be alive again. "I want to build one," Anna said. "When the ground thaws, will you show me how?" "Yes." "I want to do it differently, 2 channels instead of 1, so the heat spreads more evenly." Martha felt something shift in her chest. Not just acceptance, collaboration. Anna wasn't just copying, she was improving. The idea was spreading, evolving, becoming something bigger than one woman's desperate experiment. "We'll figure it out together," Martha said. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, 7 children slept on warm stone while 2 widows planned for spring. The storm broke on February 12th. The wind died at dawn, so suddenly that Martha woke thinking something was wrong. After 9 days of howling chaos, the silence felt louder than the noise had been. She opened the door and looked out at a world transformed. Snow drifts 15 feet high. Her barn buried to the roof line, the path to the outhouse completely gone, and above it all, a sky so blue and so cold that looking at it made her eyes water. The temperature was still 20 below zero, but without the wind, 20 below felt almost bearable. People could move. People could dig. People could begin the long work of recovering from what the blizzard had taken. Eric and Peter Lindstrom dug out their cabin that afternoon. They recovered their father's body. They found the cow dead in the barn and the chickens frozen solid, and their entire wood supply gone except for the legs of the kitchen table, which Anna had been saving in case they needed to burn them too. But they were alive. All of them. Because Martha had dug a trench across her floor and remembered a dead man's story about a war hospital in Virginia. Word spread through the settlement as people emerged from their shelters. The Krause widow had survived the blizzard with half the fuel of anyone else. The Lindstrom family had taken refuge in her soddy and walked out alive. 9 people in 320 square feet for 6 days, and every one of them had come through. Some people had not been so lucky. The Hoffman cabin, a mile west, had lost its father to frostbite, 3 fingers gone, 2 toes. The Jensens, 2 miles north, had lost their youngest child to the cold. All across Dakota Territory, families were counting their dead and wondering how they would make it through the rest of winter. But in Martha Krause's soddy, the floor was warm. The children were healthy. And the woman who everyone had said would die before Christmas was standing in her doorway, watching the sun rise over a frozen world and planning what she would plant in spring. Gustav Nordquist came in late February. He rode up on his gray mare, looking 10 years older than he had in September. The winter had cost him. Martha could see it in the way he moved, the stiffness in his joints, the hollows under his eyes. He had survived. Nordquist always survived, but surviving had taken everything he had. He dismounted and walked to her door. He didn't knock. He just stood there, looking at her chimney with its thin trail of smoke, looking at her woodpile that still held nearly a quart of fuel, looking at the tracks in the snow where children had been playing. "May I come in?" he asked. Martha stepped aside. Nordquist entered the soddy and stopped. The children were sitting on the floor, Anna playing with a rag doll, Wilhelm stacking stones, Emma crawling across the warm surface. The air inside was cool, but not cold. The stones beneath his feet radiated heat he could feel through his boots. He stood there for a long time, not moving. "I buried 2 neighbors this winter," he finally said. "The Jensen boy, Carl Lindstrom, both of them dead, and there's nothing anyone could have done differently." He paused. "That's what I told myself. Nothing anyone could have done." Martha waited. "But you did something different." Nordquist looked at her. His eyes were tired, but something in them had shifted. "I told you in September that you'd watch your children freeze. I told you to find a husband or go back east. I said those things because I believed them. Because I'd seen too many people die doing what everyone does, not having enough of what everyone needs." He knelt slowly, painfully, his old knees protesting, and pressed his palm against the floor stones. His expression changed. Wonder crept across his weathered face, softening the hard lines, making him look almost young. "It's warm," he said. "The fire's been out for hours, and the floor's warm. The stones hold the heat. They release it slowly. How long? 8 to 10 hours in normal cold, 5 or 6 when it's below 30. Nordquist stood up. He looked around the room, at the trench entrance near the fire pit, at the chimney pipe on the far wall, at the flat stones that covered the channel between them. He was calculating, Martha realized, adding up the labor, the materials, the logic. "Show me," he said. Martha spent the next hour explaining everything. The depth of the trench, the thickness of the stones, the importance of the lowered fire pit, the clay ceiling, the chimney height. She showed him where the smoke entered and where it exited, traced the path of heat through the system, explained the principle that Heinrich had described. Don't warm the air, warm the mass. The mass holds. The mass remembers. The mass gives the heat back when you need it most. Nordquist listened without interrupting. When she finished, he pulled a scrap of paper from his pocket and began to write. Measurements, materials, steps. "I'm not going to rebuild my cabin," he said. "I'm too old for that, but I'm going to add a section, a small one, just to see." He looked at her. "Would you mind if I told others about this? People who might want to try it?" Martha felt something loosen in her chest. Validation. Not from praise or apology, but from the simplest thing, a man who had dismissed her asking permission to share her idea. "Tell everyone," she said. Spring came late that year, as if winter didn't want to release its grip. The snow melted in April. The ground thawed in May. and as soon as the earth was soft enough to dig, Martha started getting visitors. 3 families from De Smet came to see her floor. They knelt on the stones, felt the warmth, asked questions she had answered a dozen times before. A German-Russian family from the settlement east of town recognized the principal immediately. They had seen something similar in the old country, a thing called a kang, a heated sleeping platform. They nodded and smiled and said yes. Yes, this was old knowledge, good knowledge, the kind of knowledge that kept people alive. Anna Lindstrom built her floor system in June. She used 2 channels instead of 1, crossing in the center of the room, spreading the heat more evenly. Her children helped carry the stones. Eric, who had turned 17 that summer, did most of the digging. When they lit the first fire, the whole family stood in the center of the room and watched the smoke travel through the trenches. And Anna cried, not from grief, though grief was still there, but from relief. She would not spend another winter burning her furniture. By autumn of 1881, 4 other families in Kingsbury County had built floor heating systems. Some copied Martha's design exactly, others modified it. Deeper trenches, different stone, channels that branched in multiple directions. The principles spread even as the specific methods varied. Reverend Whitmore never acknowledged being wrong. He came through on his circuit in July, saw the system, heard the stories, and said nothing. When Martha saw him at the church meeting in August, he looked past her as if she didn't exist. Silas Brennan had given up on her by then. He'd found another widow to marry, a woman from the settlement south of town who didn't have strange ideas about floors. Martha didn't mind. She had her land, her children, her soddy with its warm floor and its view of the prairie stretching to the horizon. She had proven up her claim. She had survived the worst winter in memory. She had done what everyone said was impossible, and she had done it alone. Well, not entirely alone. She had done it with Heinrich's memory, with his stories, with the knowledge he had carried home from a war hospital 20 years before. She had done it with the help of neighbors who brought stones when she needed them, who took shelter when they needed it, who learned from her example and built on it. The frontier was never truly solitary. It just felt that way sometimes. Martha Krause lived until 1923. She remarried in 1886, 5 years after Heinrich's death, to a widower named Johannes Hauser, who had watched her survive the hard winter and decided he wanted a wife who could think her way through trouble. They had 2 more children together and raised all 5 to adulthood. Anna grew up to marry a farmer in Kingsbury County. She built a floor heating system in her own house, improved it with lessons learned from her mother's design, and taught her own children the principle of heating the mass instead of the air. Wilhelm became a carpenter. He never forgot watching his mother build that trench, the way she calculated and tested and adjusted until everything worked. He built houses all across Dakota, and every one of them had some piece of his mother's engineering in the foundation. Emma, the baby who nearly died in the February blizzard, lived until 1962. She was the last direct witness to that winter, the last person alive who remembered sleeping on warm stones while the world outside tried to freeze solid. In her later years, she would tell her grandchildren about it, the cold, the fear, the miracle of warm floor beneath her feet. Most of them thought she was exaggerating. Old people always made the past sound harder than it was. By the time Emma died, radiant floor heating had been reinvented 100 times over. Modern systems used hot water pipes instead of smoke flues, electric coils instead of kitchen fires. The principle was the same: heat the mass, let it radiate, but the technology had evolved beyond recognition. No one remembered Martha Krause. No one knew that a widow on the Dakota prairie had built the same system from memory and desperation, using flat stones and clay and a dead man's story about a war hospital. That's how it goes with good ideas. They spread until they become invisible. They work so well that people forget they were ever invented, ever discovered, ever figured out by someone who refused to accept that the impossible was actually impossible. The Koreans had known about it for thousands of years. They called it ondol, and they heated entire palaces with the same principle Martha used to heat her sati. The Romans had known about it too. They called it hypocaust, and they warmed their bathhouses with channels of hot air under the floors. The Chinese had their kang, the Germans from Russia, their own variations. Martha Krause didn't know any of this. She only knew what Heinrich had told her, that wounded soldiers in a Virginia winter had slept warm on heated stones while snow fell outside the tent. She took that story and made it real. She dug a trench across her earthen floor, covered it with limestone, sealed every joint with clay, and proved that a woman alone could outsmart a winter that killed strong men. In 1920, 40 years after the hard winter, Martha Krause sat in her frame house with her granddaughter. The house was modern by then. Wallpaper on the walls, a proper wooden floor, a coal stove that burned clean and warm. The old sati had been torn down in 1889, replaced by lumber and glass and all the trappings of civilization. But beneath the wooden floor, beneath the foundation, the old trench was still there. Filled in with packed earth now, the stones removed long ago, but the shape remained 14 feet of channel that had once carried smoke and heat from a cooking fire to a chimney on the opposite wall. The granddaughter, 8 years old, asked about the old days, about the winter everyone talked about the floor that stayed warm when the fire went out. Martha walked to the corner of the room, to the spot where the fire pit had once been, and tapped her foot on the boards. "Right here," she said. "The trench started right here, went all the way across to that wall." How did it work? Martha smiled. It was the question she had been asked 1,000 times by neighbors and visitors and children and grandchildren, and people who wanted to understand how a woman alone had done what everyone said couldn't be done. "Everyone thinks heat rises," she said. "That's what they teach you. Hot air goes up. So you put the stove in the middle of the room and hope the warmth spreads around." She looked down at the floor, remembering the feel of warm stone beneath her bare feet, the sight of her children sleeping peacefully while the wind howled outside. But heat doesn't just rise. Heat does what you make it do. You put it in stone, it stays in stone. You put it under the floor, it warms the floor. You give it a path, it follows the path. She tapped the boards again. The secret isn't the fire. The secret is where you put the heat afterward. The fire burns out, but the floor remembers. The granddaughter thought about this. "Could I build one?" she asked. "If you had to, if there was no other way." Martha looked out the window at the prairie, at the endless grass stretching to the horizon, at the land that had tried to kill her and failed. "But you probably won't have to. That's the thing about surviving. You do it so the next generation doesn't have to do it the same way. You figure something out, and then it becomes normal, and then everyone forgets it was ever figured out at all." She sat back down, her old bones protesting, and pulled the girl onto her lap. "The floor remembers," she said again, "even when everyone else forgets." Outside, the wind picked up. A cold front was moving in from the northwest, bringing the first hint of autumn. In a few months, winter would return, as it always did, with its cold and its darkness and its endless hunger for heat. But the houses were warm now. The stoves were good. The railroad brought coal, and the town had a doctor, and nobody would freeze to death 80 yards from their own barn. The frontier was closing. The hard times were ending. And somewhere beneath a wooden floor in Kingsbury County, a trench that had once saved 9 lives sat silent and filled with earth, waiting to be remembered.